All right, well, why don't we get started? It's 10:35. Just review quickly what we talked about last time. Uh, we did. We talked about the path of desire and the path of renunciation. Right? The path of desire is, what most people most of the time walk, right? Just fulfilling momentary desires that you have. Um, Physical pleasures, but it could also be maybe you have bigger plans than that. Maybe you want to be famous, you want to do something of value to your community. But as long as you're doing it to satisfy your ego, there's a sense in which you're just walking on that path of desire. You're always filling an emptiness that you feel within you. And Hinduism says that that's totally fine and that's normal, least this interpretation of Hinduism, we also have to keep that in mind, says that's totally fine and normal. You might go through entire lifetimes like that, right? You might be born and live a whole life of desire and then die and then be reborn and do the same thing again. But after a while, your soul, maybe in some deep sense, feels that this is just an empty kind of a cycle and you want to escape this constant repetition, and you want to become identified with something much bigger than your small little ego. And that's where the path of renunciation comes into play. And that's where the religious life of Hinduism comes into play. So where we left off was, see if I can get to it easily. There we go. These three things that, according to Houston Smith, and it makes some sense, these are three things that we want. And in a way, you could look at this as being the human condition. Right? People talk about the human condition. What is it like? Right? This is one way to think of it, is that we naturally seek some sort of equilibrium, some sort of state of contentment, some sort of happiness where you're not feeling deep pain or deep anxiety or deep boredom with life, where you feel connected to the world around you. And that's where knowledge comes into play, right? It's not intellectual knowledge that we're talking about here. It's a certain kind of connection to your surroundings, right? And being as well. We crave our own continued existence. And what kind of beings are we? We are beings who are capable of feeling joy and capable of feeling connection with the world around us. So all three of these things go together, right? Our being that defines you, your essence. Well, human beings are different from other objects in the world. Right? Maybe our bodies are objects, but from within we have consciousness. We're subjects. Right? So that subjectivity is what allows you to feel joy and to feel pain and things like that, and it allows you to feel connection and disconnection. There's no problem with this candle over here, right? It doesn't have a problem in life that needs to be solved. There's no sort of condition for it to struggle with. It's just in the world. It's fully there. It's fully connected. That's part of just being an object. There is no disconnect between your consciousness and the rest of the world. But for human beings, because we're self-aware, because we think abstractly, because we have language, and because we have perception of the world, it's very natural to sort of start making a distinction between the world out there and the world in here. Right? It makes sense. But what you ultimately want is to get rid of that connection and somehow retain your essence as a conscious being. And that's why Brahman, the sort of the God idea in Hinduism, is pure consciousness. But it's a kind of consciousness where there's no distinction anymore between the consciousness and then reality as it is in itself, ultimate reality. So that everything's always connected. There is no distinction. And once you realize that deep within you, there is this Atman, this deeper self that's actually identical with Brahman or identical with some aspect of Brahman, then you get rid of that disconnection between you and the rest of reality. Then you feel completely connected, completely joyful. You have fullness of being, as it's sometimes called. Right? And it sounds good, doesn't it? It sounds nice. If you could tap into that somehow, that would be great, wouldn't it? I gave the analogy of something like being in a flow state. Right? But flow states come and go, right? Flow states when you're doing something you really enjoy and you're fully connected, you're fully immersed in the activity. You're not thinking about any of your everyday anxieties. You're not bored at all. You feel alive, right? I hope everyone's had something like that where they feel that way. Children can often do this better than adults can because they haven't learned to worry quite as much yet. Right? It's that sort of a state that we're talking about here, but it's one that's sort of with you all the time, right? In no matter what you're doing. So I gave the example of doing annoying chores like dishes. Well, if you're in that flow state, if you're just fully connected with your present reality, then that can be just as fun as those other activities. Everything can be like that if you feel fully connected to what you are doing in the moment. Right? How do you do that? Right? That's the trick. How do you uh, clear away the psychological clutter in such a way that you realize your true essence as Atman and that it is identical with Brahman? How do you do that? Well, that's where the religious life comes into play. Right? That's the important thing here, and this is where the concept of the four yogas comes into really makes a lot of sense to talk about. Right? What practical advice, what practical things can I do to declutter my mind so that I can be connected with the reality around me? What can I do, practically speaking, to realize that I am Atman and that I am identical with Brahman, and in so doing become fully connected with the whole of the world, to become one with everything, as they say? And I hope everyone sees the connection there, right? You've sure you've heard this term, becoming one with everything. Okay. Remember what the old joke? What did the Buddhists say to the hot dog vendor? Make me one with everything. Right. That's a bad joke. But that's the idea. Everyone's heard that phrase. And so tie that in with this idea of connection and disconnection. And tie this in with the idea that when you are really suffering, or when you're just not feeling it, or when life has got you down, or when you're just bored, it's always a form of disconnection from your environment. It's always a sort of, you're in your own head, you're letting your internalized expectations run the show, right? Constantly judging things, maybe at the subconscious level, but it's a form of being disconnected. So what you want is connection, and that's what being one with everything means, right? That there's no longer a disconnect between you and the world around you. So how do we do that? How do we achieve that? Well, I'm sure you've heard the word yoga before, and when you hear yoga, you think of a specific, you're actually thinking of a specific practice of yoga. We don't often realize that in the West, because yoga as a form of exercise has become very popular. So when you hear the word yoga, you're probably just thinking of all the postures, downward dog, and all that stuff. Now, those are part of practicing yogas, but yoga is a much larger concept in Hinduism, right? And so we can sort of, this is almost kind of a fun thing to do, right? People see themselves in different ways, right? There's different personality types. The four yogas are supposed to sort of match with four different personality types. So we've got four different yogas for four different personality types. Now, I wouldn't get too rigid about this. When I look at these four personality types, I think everyone is a mix of all of them. I don't think anyone is just one. So I don't think you need to look at this and figure out, well, which yoga is the one that's right for me. I don't think you have to be that rigid about it, right? But just sort of get into the idea that there are general psychological tendencies that people have, even though everyone's a mix, okay? So we have got four different yogas. What is a yoga if it's not just doing the body postures and the exercise that we're all familiar with? What is a yoga? Well, these are practical approaches to that project of transcending your ego, that finite self, transcending it, clearing away all its expectations, all the psychological clutter, so that your deeper sense of yourself, can integrate with the divine. Right? So it's a way to grasp that your true essence, your Atman, is identical with absolute being itself, Brahman, which is the God concept in Hinduism. And Brahman is a kind of pure blissful consciousness. How weird do we want to get about this, right? Some people think Brahman is almost more like a traditional god, an actual being with a mind. For some people, it's much more philosophical. I mean, you could just think of Brahman as nothing separate at all from individual human consciousness, right? Maybe it's just a way of talking about the thing that we all share as human beings. We all share consciousness. Maybe that's all you mean by it. This is a general theme in all the religions, is that when it comes to the concept of God, there's a variety, there's a whole spectrum of ways in which you can interpret what God means, right? So here we have extremes. We have something like Brahman is a creator God with a mind who thinks thoughts and you can communicate with. Or maybe Brahman is just a way of talking about our collective consciousness, in which case you're not really talking about anything supernatural at all, right? So, you don't have to make up your mind about what it means. I'm just telling you that there are different ways to interpret Brahman. And I tend to always go for the less weird one, or, well, I shouldn't say weird, but the less supernatural interpretation. But certainly there are many Hindus who will think of Brahman as my Lord, just the same way that Christians talk about Jesus as their Lord. Okay. And this gets especially complicated when you get into all the avatars or all the representations of Brahman. But here, this is supposed to be something you shouldn't get too worried about the metaphysical story that you need to tell. It's actually something that you need to experience, right? And so the project really here with doing yoga is not necessarily to have some sort of theological, intellectual understanding of God. It is rather to do something practical to become connected to your reality, right? To do something practical, to get rid of that sense of disconnect between you and the rest of the world, between you and other people, to become fully connected, to enter into that flow state for your whole life, not just for the activities that you've labeled as fun. That's what your ego does, right? Your ego says, I like this, but not that. I like this, but not that. When you transcend that small constructed ego, this socially constructed ego, the claim here is that you tap into something deeper. And once you do that, once you realize that there is really no disconnection between you and the rest of the world, that's the state you want to be in. So what does God mean? You kind of don't have to worry about it, right? Yoga these are practical approaches to achieve the state of mind that we are talking about here. So there's different approaches that you can do for different personality types. And again, I think it would be a mistake for you to say, I'm definitely just that type, so I'm just going to do that type of yoga. I think probably if any one of you or anybody in the world at all is going to sort of experiment with Hinduism, you'd probably be well off to try all of it, right? To try all the different approaches. Don't box yourself in. So we have the 4 personality types here. And maybe you could think of this as sort of an axis, right? Reflective, active, emotional, experimental, and you're somewhere within that Cartesian graph there, within that Cartesian plane. You're somewhere in there. You don't have to say I'm just this one, but you're sort of a mix of all of these. Okay, so you got the reflective personality, who is going to be drawn to jnana yoga. The emotional personality, it's bhakti yoga. Active personality, karma yoga. Experimental personality, raja yoga. Okay, and even in the practices themselves, there will be some overlap. Okay, not just the personalities that I think overlap in individual human beings, but even in the practices, some things are similar to one another, as we'll see. So we'll just go through these one by one. The reflective personality. This is, if I had to pick one that I lean towards, it would be this, right? I mean, I study philosophy, so it's like that. You're introspective. You have a philosophical tendency. And here, the idea is that for this type of personality, you can achieve this oneness that we're talking about, this connection to the divine or to just blissful consciousness, which is, sort of the same here, right? So again, is the divine something separate? Maybe it just means blissful consciousness, a fullness of being, a fullness of connection, right? How do you achieve that oneness? If you're an introspective kind of type, then it's through knowledge of your true God self. It's through knowledge, through at first a kind of thinking about this whole system that we're talking about, really thinking through the idea of your Atman being identical with Brahman. And it starts as an intellectual pursuit. right? Because that's where reflective personalities live. They live in a world of books, right? So you read and you become familiar with the whole tradition. You read about people's experiences. You learn. You absorb information, right? Remember, that's not what enlightenment is, right? That's not what uh, being connected to reality is. That's not what becoming one with Brahman is. Uh, but this is what reflective personalities like to do. They like to learn. They like to read and look at different perspectives and learn the history of ideas. So that's where the reflective personality will start, doing what they do best. And once you've internalized all this knowledge, all these wisdom traditions, all this knowledge about how people have achieved these kinds of states and what it's like, you've thought about the metaphysics of it all, right? Then you internalize all that, and then you reflect, you self-reflect, because that's something else that philosophical types do. They're introspective by nature already, right? So you've absorbed all the information. Now you go within yourself, uh, and you process that and you integrate that with your whole being. Right? So then over time, you've achieved this deeper understanding of what your true divine essence is. It's no longer just intellectual. You've worked with it internally enough that something has clicked in your mind, something has clicked over, and you go, aha, I get it, right? That's a favorite of introspective philosophical types as well, right? That's the fun of learning, when you have something really hard and then you have an aha moment, right? That's the addictive part of learning. That's the addictive part that keeps philosophical types going in their quest for knowledge, because once you get that aha moment, it's like light suddenly shining, right? A clearing of the path. And so the idea is here that that can happen. Once you've learned, you've done the intellectual work, then you've done the introspective work, and you get a kind of aha moment where you realize, I have a deeper self, Atman, and it is identical with Brahman. So at this point, it's no longer just an intellectual acceptance, right? It's no longer just, maybe you convinced already that Atman equals Brahman, right? Maybe some of you get it, and you're like, yeah, that's right. I think that doesn't mean that you've achieved this enlightened state yet, right? Just understanding something is not enough. You got to live it, right? In evangelical Christianity, there's a similar thing that Billy Graham used to say this. He was a famous Christian preacher, basically. He says, you know of Jesus, but do you know Jesus? Right? The idea is it's not enough just to intellectually understand what the Bible says, right? From an evangelical Christian perspective, you need to actually throw yourself into a real relationship with this being, right? It's got to be practiced and felt, not just intellectually understood. So we have a similar idea here as well. Right? You feel the truth. You don't just know it intellectually. It's a lived experience of this deeper reality. Here's an exercise that an introspective person can do, but really that anybody can do. When you think about, you say to yourself, I see, I think, I feel. What is that I? What does that refer to? Right? When I say the word book, here we can point to this book right here. When I say the word cup, I can point to this cup over here. Say the word body, I can point to this body here. When you say the word I, well, surely that has a reference. Surely is the name of something real. What is that I? What is the I that thinks and feels and sees? What is that? Now, you can't do this right now, right in the middle of a lecture. But this is something to think about for a while. It's something you can sit and reflect on. What is the I that feels and sees and perceives? There's a sense in which, and this becomes especially true in meditation, which we're not quite doing here, but there's a sense in which you realize that there's a pure awareness simple consciousness. In meditation and in introspection, there's some part of you that can become aware of that ego self. When you sit in complete quiet, you've quieted down your thoughts, and you simply watch yourself as a person. And you see your thoughts go by, maybe you can't get rid of all your thoughts, but you watch them go by, and you sort of realize what kind of person you are in the world. And there's a certain way in which you're separating yourself from your everyday self. Right? You're becoming identified just with consciousness. And that's what the goal of meditation often is to become identified with that self that is pure consciousness. Right? Because again, once you become aware, yes, Alicia.
I've tried to do this many times during my life.
Uh-huh.
I never really managed. I
Yeah.
started riding a motorcycle 3 years ago, and I have come closest to this purely in the moment
Uh-huh.
state of being because of the incredible focus that it takes to be on a
Right.
machine like that. It takes
Right.
it like quiets all the noise in my mind and kind of concentrates it down to just right now and the few seconds
Right.
ahead.
Mm-hmm.
It's the closest I've ever come to really thinking about this.
Right.
And the joy that comes with that detachment from
Mm-hmm.
everything else but just this. It's pretty
Mm-hmm.
amazing.
Yeah,
Yeah.
so you have a good model for understanding what this is talking about, right? So you kind of get it, yeah. And it's true, meditation it's a little bit different, right? It's it's something that's usually thought of as pretty difficult, and it requires you to stick with it for a very long time, and it requires you to understand what it is that you're doing when you're doing it. And it requires that you don't judge yourself, right? A lot of people think, oh, I'm going to meditate, and then after I meditate for 10 minutes, I should feel something. I should feel happier or more relaxed. Now, you can use meditation as a relaxation technique, but that's not really what it's supposed to be, right? It's supposed to be doing work on yourself so that we're going on a slight digression about meditation. I've practiced it in the past. I'm sort of fallen off the wagon, but I've had some experience with it. And I think the most helpful thing to learn is that don't think that you're going to quiet your mind. Don't think that you're going to get something out of it this session, right? It's just important to sit and do this activity. And every time that you catch yourself thinking, that's a mini enlightenment moment, right? So people get frustrated. They're like, I'm supposed to empty my mind when I meditate, but instead I've got all these thoughts going on. But that's actually really important. That's what we're talking about here. When you become aware that there are these thoughts going on, you are sort of stepping outside of your everyday self and you're becoming pure consciousness. So instead of getting frustrated every time you have a thought while you're meditating, it should be something that you celebrate. You're like, I just became aware for a second. I just became consciousness itself, being aware of my everyday self. My everyday self is constantly thinking and doing all this stuff. But when in meditation, you become conscious of that rather than getting frustrated, being like, here I go thinking again, right? When I'm supposed to have a quiet mind, I'm supposed to be meditating and getting something out of it. And instead, I'm just thinking about all my everyday stuff. How annoying. I'm bad at meditation. No, instead, that's actually really good. That's what you're looking for, right? And over time, you can get that part of your mind out more. You can become this kind of pure consciousness more and more. So this is why, monks, they got to take this seriously, right? Monks in monastery, like Buddhist monks who do this. It's a thing that you do from morning till night. You have meditation sessions, but then you also have, your chores that you do, and you're supposed to bring your whole mind and awareness to those chores and immerse yourself fully in them. So yeah, people meditate and they say, well, I'm not getting out of it what I'm supposed to get out of it. But I think it just takes a lot more discipline. Right? It's hard to unlearn all the thinking that we do all the time. Right? It's just hard to do. And when you meditate, that becomes painfully obvious. And, maybe you don't think you've got a lot of stuff going on here, But sit down for a second, and all of a sudden, all that stuff that is at the subconscious level suddenly rises up to your consciousness, and that's where people get frustrated. But that's actually a good place to be. So if you can manage to sit for 10 minutes a day, even having all the thoughts going on, right? But just you gently bring yourself back to the task of trying to just be still and experience your breath, or experience the feelings in your body, or listen to sounds. Like, there's many ways to meditate, but you need some sort of anchor, some sort of thing you're paying attention to get you away from your thoughts. But then when you start seeing those buzzing thoughts again, that's totally fine. That's just part of the practice. You go, okay, there's myself thinking again. Okay, let me get back to my breath, right? So anyway, I don't know if, if that's good advice for anybody who is interested in meditation or has tried it before, but the biggest pitfall is just getting frustrated with your mind thinking all the time. But that's actually a good thing when you notice it, right? Okay. And the moment that we're looking for, the moment that okay, good, that we're talking about here is that little awareness when you become aware of yourself. It's as though you've tapped into that Atman, that is just pure consciousness. And you're no longer identified with that everyday self because you're looking at it from the outside. How can you look at something? How can you be aware of something? Well, you still have to be conscious. Right? You have to be some form of awareness. Some subjectivity is involved. But it is no longer your everyday self because you're looking at your everyday self. So now you've moved from the conditioned to the unconditioned. You've managed to get closer to Brahman, to just this fully connected, conscious joy, bliss being. You may not feel bliss in that moment, right? But this is a practice that takes time. And so over time, you get rid more and more of identifying with that everyday self. Now, you still got to live your life, right? So you're still going to have that self. I don't know how feasible it is to completely disintegrate your everyday self. I mean, especially for those of us who have roles to play in our community. If you're a parent or a spouse or a friend, you kind of have to play these roles still. But it's a matter of how much are you identifying all the time with this sort of busybody self with all its expectations, and how much can you sort of stand back and just be and just have this kind of connection to what it is that you're doing. And that's what we're aiming for here. So again, you could get really caught up in the metaphysics of the religion. Right? What are all the gods? What do they mean? What is Brahman? Is it really a separate being? Is it something that's thinking thoughts about me? Is it what created the world? Well, you can get into those questions, but what we're focusing here on is a lived experience that individual human beings can transform their inner conscious life. Right? And so here, one of the ways to do that is the Jnana Yoga way. That's for the more reflective personality, which right here we haven't. This has not actually addressed meditation, but this is a form of meditation. When you contemplate the identity of that consciousness that can become aware of yourself, you are contemplating Atman. And then the next step is to realize that that's sort of what it means to be one with the divine from an experiential point of view. Another way to put this is that from the point of view of this pure consciousness, when in self-reflection or in meditation, you become aware of yourself, then you realize this everyday self is kind of a mask that you wear. Right? It's sort of a thing that's Brahman as an individual Atman goes out into the world, and all these things are put on it by society and by your life experiences and by the way in which you have to relate to other people. And it's sort of a persona that you adopt, right? It's sort of a mask or to use the word avatar again, right? It's not just Vishnu that's an avatar, or Krishna rather. It's you yourself are an avatar of the divine, right? You have a specific personality and all that. So do all these gods, right, that we can talk about in Hinduism. They all have their specific role, in that way they're sort of egoic creatures. They have egos themselves, but those are just avatars of this larger unconditioned being, this divine essence of consciousness and bliss. And so maybe it's necessary to wear this mask, but realize that that's not your true nature, right? Your true nature is sort of divine in this sense that we're talking about. And again, you could mean that in a very supernatural way, or you could just mean that you can tap into this deep-seated joy, this deep-seated connection to reality around you. You can interpret this very metaphysically or just psychologically. Right? It's up to you. And this kind of talk comes up a lot in different Eastern religion, right? So we're going to see many, many similarities between this and Buddhism and even Taoism and Zen Buddhism especially. We'll see many iterations of this. So what prevents us from realizing our divine nature, or from achieving enlightenment, or from achieving oneness with being? What prevents us from achieving this kind of bliss, blissful states? Not a euphoric state, right? Something a little bit different like that, but maybe you can feel euphoric. But what prevents us? Well, because we identify with the mask. We identify with the persona. We identify with the avatar. We think to ourselves mistakenly when we're living our everyday life and we're getting caught in these loops, and these sometimes mini reincarnation loops within a lifetime, right? But also these loops of seeking pleasure, avoiding pain, right? Thinking I need this, and that because this is the person that I am, and here's the story I've told about myself, and this is how I'm supposed to be. These are the things I deserve, and these are the things I don't want. These are the things I want to avoid. This is what I need in my life to be happy. Right? That's all just your persona, and that's okay. We need to live life in the world. But it's when you've become fully identified with that self that you are limiting yourself to something smaller. You're again, I keep making this little motion to signify this limited ego self that's been constructed by your life experiences and by your cultural expectations and all of that. Well, you can transcend that when you realize that your true nature is much deeper than that, right? Your true nature is your consciousness that you share with all human beings. And in that sense, we're all alike, right? We all are humans, right? We all share humanity. And a large part of that sharing of humanity is the fact that we're all conscious. And that's what defines us at a deeper level. And that's what connects us all on a deeper level. We're all going through this sort of life, right? Through this subjective world. Again, cups and books don't have to worry about that, right? Consciousness is our blessing and our curse, because when we become conscious, it creates this illusion of separation between us and the rest of the world. But it's an illusion. You can pierce through that through doing these different yogas. And here the idea is that for the reflective personality, when you think all this through, something will click. And it's probably not enough just to see this little slideshow right here, right? This says specifically you need to go study. You need to go read, right? That's the first step for the reflective personality, the learner, the intellectual, the person who thrives on learning new information. That's where you start, but you can integrate this and then introspect until you realize what this really means. And when you really realize it, something happens within you. You become transformed. It is no longer just an intellectual understanding. You feel it, right? That's at least the promise given here. Okay. Any questions on Jnana Yoga? No. There's the more emotional personality. And again, these are not mutually exclusive. I'm emotional too. I'm a sensitive person, right? So they don't have to be one or the other. Right? But we have general tendencies, right? And it might depend where you are today in your life, right? Maybe today you're really into learning, reading books. Maybe later on you become more emotional or affective, right? It can change, or it can change depending on your mood, right? So don't box yourself into one of these personalities. These are like axes, and you're somewhere in there, perhaps moving around depending on the time of day, okay, or the time in your life. So emotional, affective personalities can achieve this enlightenment, this becoming one with the divine, union with God, the realization that you are Atman and Atman is Brahman, right, through bhakti yoga. So bhakti yoga, traditionally in Hindu traditions, focuses on love and adoration. Right? This makes sense. So you might think of someone whose role it is to be there for other people. Maybe you're a parent and you deeply love your children and you take care of them, right? Maybe you're just that kind of a person that you feel connection to other people through the bonds of love. Uh, that defines most people in some way. Again, right? Don't box yourself in too much. But some people maybe more than others. Maybe some people really get that sort of forgetting yourself, right? Because you're so connected to the other person. Right? So union with the divine there is achieved through a kind of love relationship with a personal God, right? So not just this abstract Brahman, collective unconsciousness, undefined mostly, right? This fullness of being, right? Philosophers like that kind of a thing, right? Abstract ideas, abstract principles. They can get that. But for some people, they need to personify the divine. This is so important in many forms of Judeo-Christianity and Islam as well, right? Where it's important that the God that you are connecting with has a personality, has a face almost, something that you can relate to on a personal level, because we are sort of wired for that, and all of us are, right? To relate to other people, to other human beings. You think about what do they do to prisoners short of death uh, in order to really punish them? Well, they put them in solitary confinement. Right? And when you're away from people for too long, you lose your mind. Right? So we need other people. We need to feel connected to the world through other people. This is natural. And it's for some people, when they talk about the divine, this needs to be itself like a person, right? Like somebody that you love in your family. God needs to be somebody that you love as a person. And so Bhakti Yoga zeroes in on that. It's not some sort of non-personal absolute being like the jnana approach is comfortable with. Here, you create a kind of loving relationship, right? So again, Christian traditions are often like that as well, right? There's this famous verse in the Bible that says, love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. Right? That's sort of, how you might feel about the person that you're in love with, or your partner, or your child, right? You love them with all your heart, your soul, and your mind. That's this feeling approach, right? That connects you to this other being, that forges this sort of union with them, right? A oneness. That's why people often talk about two people coming together and forming a union, right? When people get married or something like that. You become one with another somehow. We talk about people becoming a unit, right? We talk about people dating for a while and then they're so together and we say, well, they're a unit, they're together. Right? And so the idea here is that for some people, it's easier to achieve this oneness with the divine if we picture the divine as a personal being that you can love and adore, just as you can very naturally and easily love and adore the object of your affection. Let's see, the Tulsidas story. This is a story that we find in the Hindu tradition, and it's basically, the idea is this guy is trying to find enlightenment, but he's so devoted to his wife. I'm summarizing it badly. I haven't read this for a while. But the wife basically says, look, if you were as devoted to God as you are to me, you would find enlightenment in an instant, right? Because if you've ever had the experience of really falling in love with somebody, it's effortless, right? You feel so connected to this person. It's not something you're trying to achieve through meditation and practice and reading books like the Yana approach, right? It's just an instant connection with the person. You don't even have to try. Right? That's the idea here. So if you can tap into that natural ability that we have to really feel connected to another person, and if you can transfer that feeling to the realm of the divine, then enlightenment could become easy. Again, I think that's the attraction of many forms of Christianity that focus on the relationship between the believer and the God of that religion, right? Or usually that's Jesus Christ, because Jesus Christ is more relatable than God the Father, right? Because we see Jesus Christ walking around as a human being in the New Testament, and we see depictions of Jesus. And so when people love Jesus, it's like that, right? And they get excited. If you've ever talked to an evangelical Christian who's really into their faith, it's an exciting thing for them, and it's so real, and it feels so real, and they have an everyday working relationship with God, and they talk to God, and God talks to them, and it transforms their inner life. I don't doubt that this happens within Christianity, but it also happens here within this particular form of practicing Hinduism. Right? So you've got all these gods that are personifications of a single godhead, right? Brahman is still there as sort of this supreme being. Let's just call it being without judging too much what that means. But there are all these gods within the Indian pantheon that people talk about when they say, oh, Hinduism is polytheistic. Well, all polytheism is in quotes, because most forms of polytheism do have something at the very top. And things like Christianity have many things in the middle, like angels and things like that. Okay. So these myths and these deities, on this interpretation, they're symbolic, but I do have to say, that's Houston Smith saying this, I do think that for many people who practice Hinduism, they do take it quite literally. I think very many people believe literally in the existence of these gods that they choose to devote themselves to, right? But you could think of them as symbolic, right? You can think of them as representing a more abstract realm, but it's difficult for some people to relate to this abstract idea of Brahman. So they can relate instead to some sort of personification, to some sort of symbolic form of that higher being, something that's personal, so that you can tap into our natural ability to love and to feel one with somebody and to transfer that onto the divine realm. Right. So we could take that symbolically, or you could say, no, literally, I devote myself to this God, and I think this God is real, right? A range of ways, there's a spectrum of interpretation of what it means for something to be a God and what the status of its existence is, right? Very literal or just symbolic, depends who you ask. So when you make God your priority in life, you achieve self-transcendence. Just as in some sense, when you are truly devoted to another person, whether as a parent or as a lover, whatever it may be, you achieve a kind of self-transcendence too, because it is no longer just your own ego that you're worried about. It's as though you've put yourself next to this other self, they become one, and you want what's best for that union. You don't just want what's best for you, you want what's best for that union between the two souls. And in doing that, you achieve a kind of self-transcendence. With individual people, it's somewhat limited, but with God, it's an absolute kind of self-transcendence, right? Because you become identified, right? You realize this deeper sense of yourself, this Atman, is identical with Brahman. It's just that you picture this in a way that's like a relationship between two people, you and God, or some sort of personification of God, some sort of symbolic version of God, an avatar of God. And there's different ways in which you can do this, just as there are different types of love between human beings, right? There's the love between romantic partners, the love between really deep, good friends, the love between a parent and child. There are different models of love that you can draw on here, and you can sort of choose what kind of relationship you feel like is going to help you the best. And that's why you have this whole pantheon of gods, not just because people are thinking that these beings are required as an explanation for natural phenomena, right? All the gods have sort of their realm that they're in charge of. That's part of their personalities. And so, as a bhakti practitioner, you can pick one as your focus. So you might be drawn towards this god, lowercase g god, more than this one, right? So that's why you have this whole pantheon, is because there are many different types of people who are drawn to different personalities, just like in real life, and who maybe want to foster that love relationship in a different way from this person over here. Right? Just like in real life, we are thankful that there are many people out there. Some people we're not going to vibe with, other people we do vibe with, and you don't want to always be romantically involved with all the people that you vibe with, right? Maybe you just want to be friends with them. So there are different ways in which this love relationship can play out, and depending on what kind of person you are, you might pick this god rather than this god to love and adore, right? And to worship and to pay homage to and to sacrifice to and things like that. Right, so you pick one of the incarnation as your Ishta, as it's called, right? That's your sort of your personal God that you are fostering a relationship with in order to achieve this union with the divine. Because throughout it all, even if you believe in the literal existence of these beings, it's still supposed to point further upwards to the higher divine, to the higher realm, right? So again, there's this sort of triangle formulation here. At the very top, there's some sort of idea of absolute being, consciousness, Brahman, but it's difficult for some people down here to directly relate to that. So you relate to it through one of these intermediary beings that you can relate to and develop a loving relationship with. Okay, is this making sense to people, I hope? It's so hard to do these classes not in person, right? Because I can look around the class and see where everybody's at. But if anybody has questions or needs me to explain anything, stop me. I'm probably over explaining everything already, so. Okay, moving on to the active personality. So karma, you've probably heard the word karma before, right? Karma has to do with what you do. It has to do with your actions in the world. So this type of personality, if you're naturally sort of ambitious, remember when we talked about the path of desire? A higher path of desire is where, maybe you want to become famous and influential or rich or something like that, but you can only do those things by offering something of value, right? There is something always kind of good. We kind of tend to downplay, well, you shouldn't try to find fame or fortune or influence. But, however, to achieve those things, you do need to make something of yourself. You do need to be disciplined and offer something of value to society, or you will not become powerful or influential or famous or rich, right? You need to offer something, right, that people value. So if you're that kind of person who sort of wants to put themselves out there, make a name for themselves, or at least, make waves out there somehow, right? Not as introspective, more more extroverted, right? You're that type of person, then you create this path to God. You find this union with the divine. You realize the identity between your Atman and your Brahman through good works. So you throw yourself fully into the activities of your everyday life, right? Because that's where you're most at home, is your everyday activities, right? So this is good for people who often do already feel a state of flow when they're engaged in this kind of ambitious activity. Everywhere, it's sort of, where do you find naturally your flow, right? So the learner, the intellectual, finds it in learning, right? Emotional person, the emotive affective person, finds it in relationships. The active personality finds that in their life projects. what they do for their job, right? What they do in their community. So the bhakti approach. Go back for a second. So I'm just going back to this so you realize how much these things sometimes overlap, right? So we made bhakti yoga into a particular type of thing, but as it turns out, bhakti yoga is actually one way to do karma yoga. Okay, that might get confusing, but that's the way it plays out. So, when you have this devotional relationship with God or with one of the personifications of God, and you are fully immersed in this love, and you have this love of God flowing in you, right? It's flowing from God to God, and from God to you, and you have a sort of an overflowing of this love that you get from this relationship with God. Then you can use that overflow of love to help other people in your community. You become God's instrument for good in the world. This, again, strong corollaries with certain versions of Christianity, right? Where that's the idea, right? You form this loving relationship with God, and this love of God overflows, and you want to just spread God's love. That's what many evangelical Christians feel like they're doing, right? I'm just spreading the love that I feel, and I want to help people in my community and set an example and show them that it's possible to feel this way, to feel so connected to God that you have a surplus of love and you have so much to give to people. So if you're, that's why this is sort of like, well, you could have this naturally emotive kind of personality, but you're also very driven to do things in the world. Well, then you can combine them. You can combine the karma yoga with the bhakti yoga. Or you do the jnana approach, right, which we already talked about. And then if it's your work is sort of the intellectual pursuit, then you can throw yourself into that. But you do what the jnana yoga practitioner does. You identify with that kind of consciousness that we're talking about that lies at the bottom or behind your everyday self. Right? So again, if you are the type of person who throws themselves into their work, you are likely to be more along the affective emotional type or more along the intellectual philosophical type. So here you can combine whichever one you want. Right? So this is why I say these all kind of overlap in many ways. But the idea here is that this gives you the opportunity to do what you naturally do if you're this extroverted, ambitious type, whether you are interested in helping people in the community or whether you're doing scholarly work, whatever it is, you can do this. You can achieve this union with God through your work, provided that you have the right kind of attitude behind it. It's not the particular everyday activities that really matter. It's the attitude with which you do with which you do them, right? So I think it's interesting. Am I frozen for anybody else? I'm frozen to myself in the camera. Let me just redo the camera.
Yes, you look like you're in an attitude of prayer.
Yeah. Okay, and I'm back. Okay. So I know this might be confusing, right? Because we're saying karma yoga, that's a specific thing, and then we just end up talking about bhakti and jnana again. It's a subtle kind of thing here, okay? This is specifically for the kind of person who's also very ambitious. You're probably everyone's somewhere along this spectrum of very emotional, very intellectual. You're somewhere in there, right? But what if you also happen to be a very extroverted kind of person? In addition to that, somebody who's really ambitious, who wants to do, who really throws themselves into their work. Some people don't identify that much with their work, right? Some people just don't. You do your job to pay the bills, and then you have the rest of your life, and that's where you seek that fulfillment or that sort of oneness with the divine. Not in your work. That's just something you do for the moment, right? But for some people, they really throw themselves into their work, and that's where they feel the most connected. Right? Well, if you're like that, then you still will sort of fall back on either bhakti or jnana as sort of the more efficient way for you to feel connected to the divine. So that's what that means here. And ultimately, it's what kind of attitude is, why are you doing these things? And in both cases, you need to be doing this in service of the union that you're seeking with God. And it's not, well, I need to do this so people can recognize me for the cool person that I am, or I need to write this book so that people will think I'm smart, right? That's not the right attitude. You can do great works, you can write great books, you can be of value to your community, but ultimately you have to think of these as routes not to self-satisfaction, but routes to the dissolution of the self, to union with God in some sense, in the many ways in which that can be interpreted, right? Okay, the last one, experimental personality. This is Raja Yoga. The experimental, say scientific, empirical, right? Somebody who needs to experience things to believe them, for example, right? That type of personality will find God through psychophysical experiments. Let's explain what that means. Again, the other types will want to do these things as well, okay? But the experimental type will throw themselves more into this. Mental exercises, right? To pierce through the layers of the self to being itself, right? To God. So psychophysical, psycho means psychological, physical obviously means physical, but it has the aim of piercing through that false self to find the deeper self that is really Brahman, right? To find your way to the divine. So there's many different ways to say this, right? What are the four layers? Well, first there's the body. There's the conscious mind, subconscious mind, and then being itself, right? That's where you want to get. So the exercises help you sort of travel through each of these, sort of uncovering the layers of the onion until you get to the core, right? Until you get to Brahman. We call it Atman because that's the part of you that you find. But of course, Atman is just a part of Brahman in the end, right? Atman isn't actually distinct from Brahman. It's just where Brahman finds itself in you. So when it comes especially to the body, our body has in it conditioned all sorts of wants and desires, right? We've talked about wants and desires before and how we're supposed to sort of uncondition our minds from being so identified with those needs. Many of our needs, many of our desires have to do with what our body wants, right? And so, in service of what your body wants, in service of physical satisfaction, you might be tempted towards all sorts of actions. And this is saying, step number one, the first rule here, right, is to abstain from violence, lying, thieving, sensuality. Put an asterisk next to that because that one's a little bit different from the other ones, right? But that is part of it, and greed. I'm saying that because the other ones are all obviously bad, right? Violence, deceit, theft, greed are all obviously bad in themselves. We don't have to explain that too much. Sensuality is a little bit yeah, it's not necessarily such a bad thing, right? Depending on the context. But the idea here is that usually these are in service of some sort of carnal desire that you have, some sort of physical desire that you are identifying with, when you ought to be identifying with this deeper self, this very still, unconditioned consciousness that's Atman, that's Brahman. So the first step is to just abstain from those things, to train yourself to transcend your bodily desires. This can start to look very dogmatic, right? This can start to look like these absolute rules that you have to follow. And for some, it must be interpreted in that way. For some, it's just, well, these are the rules of my religion. We have to follow these. But of course, the whole approach that we're taking here is that the end goal is some sort of inner transformation. And so far, it looks like there's different ways that you're allowed to do that. So we don't have to be dogmatic about it. You don't have to be. Some people are dogmatic about it, and these are just rules that you have to follow. And so maybe all forms of sensuality are just bad, right? We find this in Christian traditions as well sometimes. Uh, but I think the overall point of all these rules is that you are trying to not become too tightly identified with these desires of the egoic self, which are often tied to physical carnal desires. And so one way to train that is to train your behavior to be a better person, to be more in tune with that divine essence that's already complete, right? If you already feel good and complete, there's no need for you to commit acts of violence towards other people or to deceive people to get what you want, because you're already complete. You already have what you want, right? And maybe the case could be made that there's no need for you to seek out a sexual partner, right? Because you are just identifying with that physical part of you that's not really you. And if you really want enlightenment, and that's a big thing we're asking for, then maybe it requires that kind of sacrifice, right? That's why we have many traditions, uh, religious traditions that say you need to abstain from all forms of sex, right? That's why monks, whether they're Christian monks or whether they're Buddhist monks, will often take a vow of abstinence, right? Because they're serious about this goal of achieving enlightenment. And so maybe that's just true, right? So I'm still stuck on the sensuality part. It's easy to accept that you need to not be violent and lie to people and be greedy. Those are all just bad. Uh, Sensuality, though, or sexuality, well, and sensuality doesn't just have to mean, of course, sexuality. It can also mean things like eating a lot of food because you enjoy food, right? It can mean various ways of titillating the senses. So it doesn't just have to be sex. It could be food. It could be maybe even music. Who knows? But in all these forms, you're sort of catering to what your sensual body wants. You want those things, so you go after them. And if you are really serious about the goal of enlightenment, the goal of becoming one with God, then you need to sort of let those things go, right? You're trying to become identified with something deeper within you. So, maybe it's necessary after all, right? Uh, Cleanliness, and we can interpret that on many levels, right? Not necessarily just your house needs to be in order, but mental cleanliness as well, psychological cleanliness. And it's part of just the discipline that's involved in religious practice. Contentment, right? Just working on being content, self-control, studiousness, contemplation of the divine. All these things sort of allow you to pierce through the layers of this false self to something higher, right? That's the idea here, right? Because Raja is about using psychological exercises and physical exercises, physical discipline to pierce through that false self that we've created to get to something higher. Right? One way you do that is to train your body, right? To get that self-discipline by practicing different body postures. This is where we get yoga, right? So this is what we're talking about when, there's all these yoga studios out there. People do yoga for exercise. I feel like I need it. I don't do that enough. But traditionally, this is a part of a religious practice. It's this religious practice that's specifically associated with Raja Yoga, and it's a physical exercise that is meant to create a kind of bodily and mental discipline that allows you to pierce through that false self to the real self, to the divine. Training of the breath, right? So we're back to meditation, right? Most people probably know this, but many forms of meditation ask you to pay attention to your breath. That's a very simple form of working with the breath, right? That's just where you just sit. You don't even try to breathe, right? You just naturally breathe, and you just pay attention to that to try to clear away clutter, to try to build your focus on some particular activity. That focus that comes naturally when you're doing something fun, like riding a motorcycle, right? But here you're training your brain, to put it in physical scientific terms, you're training your brain to create that kind of focus on demand, right? That's what meditation is. But training the breath here is not just simple breathing meditation, it's actual breathing exercises as well, okay? See if I say anything about that. Breathing exercises as well. So I've mentioned this before. I've done a little bit of that cold training, right? Immersing yourself in cold water. Uh, there's a Dutch guy. I'm Dutch too, by the way. There's a fellow Dutch guy whose name is Wim Hof, and he does these kind of stuff where he sits in ice water for long periods of time. And he has you do a breathing exercise that works really well for sort of warming you up before you get into this. And it's basically, I can tell you what it is right now. You basically breathe in and out really deep 30 times. Try it 3 times with me, okay? Really deep. Do you feel any kind of tingling yet? I can feel a little bit after just 3 breaths. I feel a little warmer, a little tingly, okay? Now, you do that 30 times, and on the final time, you breathe out, and you hold. You don't breathe. You hold your breath, but you hold it on the out breath. And if you do 30 deep breaths like that, you'll feel this kind of warmth going through your body, kind of tingling. And you just hold it for a little bit until it becomes uncomfortable and you want to breathe, and you breathe in and hold that for a little bit. And this one feels really good. You get that breath of air and you again feel a renewed sort of surging of energy through your body. And you hold that for a little bit, and then you repeat. You do the 30 cycles, you do the 30 breaths again. You do that 3 times in a row. By the 3rd time you do that, you'll feel kind of high. Not every time, but if you do it good and you really commit yourself to that, it's like getting high without drugs. But it's a kind of focusing that happens, right? You're focused on the breath, but also you feel your body just suffused with a kind of energy. This doesn't happen all the time, but when you're lucky, that happens. And you can imagine that energy is a kind of warmth where suddenly your whole body just feels like it's on fire, like it's warm, and cold only happens on the surface of your skin. So you can get in this ice cold water, but feel completely protected like you're inside a warm cocoon, right? So breath exercise can be very, very powerful because there's a physiological effect that happens. Now, in many Eastern traditions, when you feel that energy, it's actually something kind of magical, right? In Taoism, they call that the Tao. You're actually feeling the energy of the Tao flowing through you. We could probably just have a scientific explanation for it as well, and that's fine. But what matters here is how that feels inside. It can feel like you're sort of focusing and you kind of become more connected with your environment because you kind of have this inner energy that's flowing through you. Right? So breath training is a psychophysical exercise. You're doing something with your mind, you're doing something with your body, and you're achieving some kind of great focus in this way. And this focus allows you to pierce through this constructed self that we want to sort of clear away to reveal the divine, which we can interpret in different ways again. But here I'm focusing on the experiential part of it, the sense in which you feel less disconnected from your environment and you feel more like you're in a state of flow. You feel more like just pure blissful consciousness, and you're not so wrapped up in all your everyday concerns. You train yourself to ignore sensory distractions from the outside world to focus on the inner mind. And that, again, that's usually going to take the form of some sort of meditation, right? And so if you're interested in meditation, I mentioned breath meditation. That's one. But, there are other forms of meditation. You just need some sort of anchor, right, to focus on. So if you can achieve that kind of stillness over time, it takes a lot of discipline. It takes a lot of practice. If enlightenment was easy, then everyone would just be enlightened, right? If it was easy to do this, but no, it takes some work. It takes some dedication. That's why it's a path of renunciation. That's what we're talking about here, right? It's a whole path. That's religion here has to be something of the true believer variety. You can't really take this just, I can't think of a better word, half-assed, right? You can't do it that way. You got to throw yourself in this and make it sort of your life project. And it's not going to necessarily even work in a year, right? It might take a very, very long time to sort of approach this kind of union that we're talking about, this kind of non-division, non-dualism, this non-separation that we're talking about, this ultimate state of flow, right? It takes discipline. So you train your mind, right? You train yourself to quiet your mind in meditation. And again, this is usually done by having some sort of anchor that you return to, because you cannot quiet your mind. You cannot do it, okay? Stop thinking that you can do it. Maybe a Buddhist monk who's done this for 20 years can do it. Most people who meditate cannot do it, but they get frustrated because you think you're supposed to, so you think you're doing it wrong, right? You cannot do it. You will not do it. You will not quiet your mind. But you can do this exercise of quietly and gently returning to your anchor, whether that's your breath, whether that's how your body feels. You can do a cycling meditation where you go, what do my feet feel like right now? What do my feet feel like? What do my ankles feel like now? What do my calves feel like now? You sort of cycle through your whole body. You focus on some part of your body. You hold it for a little bit. You move on to the next thing. Very soon you'll find yourself thinking about the groceries. And when that happens, you say, I've had a little enlightenment. I just saw myself from a higher perspective, right? I just saw myself from an enlightened point of view. That's okay, that's good. But let me get back to my exercise, right? And then you go back to the body again. Or you can listen. Now, number 5 was about ignoring sensory distractions. Yeah, that's one exercise you can do. But you can also actually just sit there with your eyes closed and listen. What do you hear? Right? What's that over there? Just pay attention to that. What do I hear now? Right? I hear my stomach rumbling. That's what I hear. You hear something outside. I used to live in Oakland when I did this kind of stuff. Well, actually, close to Oakland. I lived in Alameda, and I would hear the freeway in the distance, and it would always just be this low frequency, like an ohm or something like that. And I could always sort of hear that in the background, and then hear other little noises pop up here and there all around me in town. Right? So you have an anchor that you return to. Yes, your mind will go to these thoughts, and when you find yourself doing that, don't freak out. It's normal, right? Just gently go back to your anchor. So that can be sound, it can be your breath, it can be feelings in your body, it can even be sights, right? You can actually just look at colors and appreciate them. Right? You can have a mental image, right? Sometimes a meditation practitioner will say, just imagine a red dot in your mind's eye. Go back to the red dots, right? You can even just focus on your own mind and wait for a thought to appear, right? Those dreaded thoughts that appear when you're meditating, that's frustrating when you're a meditator. You can actually sit there and just wait for a thought. And a lot of times when you wait for a thought, they don't come, right? So this is sometimes a very efficient way to do it, right? Don't focus on the breath, don't focus on the body. Actually focus on the thing that's giving you problems. your mind and the thoughts that pop into it, and just watch your mind. And yeah, maybe you'll see a little thought pass through. That's okay. That's just like watching your breath, right? Now you're just watching your thoughts. That's okay too. These all help to quiet your mind, to give yourself the mental discipline anyway, and to become more connected and focused with something, right? And so mindfulness is really just meditation is practice for what we call mindfulness. And mindfulness is one way to talk about this thing that we're talking about, this connection, this state of flow to your surroundings. That's what mindfulness is supposed to be. So you can actually take your meditation practice to your everyday life, right? If you're walking from here to your car, you could just look around you and look at all the colors that you see. Look at the textures that you see on the fence over there, right? Look at the little clouds over there. You just look and see rather than, thinking about all this stuff. Just look around you, right? You can do that. So in your everyday activities, you can practice meditation in that way, just by paying attention to specific things in your environment here and now, or listening, or again, feeling your body. You can do all that. Or you're doing the dishes, instead of thinking about stuff and judging, what does it feel like when I hold the dish? What does the water feel like on my hands and it's warm? What does the dish soap smell like, right? These mundane things that you think are so far removed from contemplation of the divine, right? You think these things are mundane and everyday and boring, and we want to get close to God. Well, the goal here is that you can get close to God when you're doing the dishes, right? If you have the right kind of mindful attitude towards it, you can find that non-separation between you and ultimate being. And when you, over time, get better at quieting these distractions or just having them sort of dissipate, then what remains is that pure consciousness, that Atman, that is just a facet of Brahman. Right? That's what remains. And that's what we're trying to do. You're trying to go through the body, through the chatter of the conscious mind, digging even deeper through the subconscious mind when you finally reach being itself. That's the goal of Raja Yoga. And so, there's different ways to do this, right? But this is at least one way to think about it, to, have those first two that are a bunch of rules, basically, right? Moral rules. But when you take ethics and morality seriously, you're always sort of transcending yourself, right? Uh, when you do what is right because it's right, not because you're trying to get something out of it, you're transcending yourself, right? So that's why in the 8 steps, number 1, it seems like moral rules, right? It seems like morality. And it is, but there's a sense in which those things help you transcend your everyday self, right? Anytime you've said to yourself, boy, I really want to do this, but I know it's not right. I know I'd be mistreating someone or hurting someone, so I'm not going to do it. Right? You've transcended your ego in that sense, right? You've pierced through that false self, and you've identified with the shared consciousness that we have with one another. You've identified with our common humanity, right? If you study ethics as a philosophical discipline, a lot of it is about that, right? It's about the recognition that you are like me. We both have consciousness. We both feel pain and joy, and I can behave in certain ways that don't recognize that, right? So when I lie to you, or when I'm violent towards you, or when I steal from you, it's like I'm not recognizing your humanity. I'm not recognizing our shared consciousness that we both share, right? I'm not recognizing our shared Atman Brahman nature. But when you do behave ethically with the right attitude, you do it because you realize you're just like me. I'm just like you. We are both conscious beings who are seeking joy in life. And so I'm going to treat you that way. I'm not going to treat you differently from how I want to be treated, right? The golden rule. I care about certain things. I know you do as well. So let me treat you in the way that you are, which is you are one facet of consciousness itself, and so am I. So those first two have a lot to do with rules, but they make sense when you think about it. All right. Okay. And there's different practices, whatever allows you to develop this kind of practice that, again, it's going to be something you're going to have to practice for a while, that allows you to build the discipline to quiet your mind, to pierce through these layers, to get to this deeper sense of consciousness, which allows us to feel connected to everything. The goal here, right, union with God, is sometimes called samadhi. Right? That's what we're looking for, and it's just another word for enlightenment. Right? It's just another word for union with God, becoming one with the divine, getting rid of the separation between self and the rest of the world. Okay, and this is supposed to be, again, something that you experience. It's not a list of metaphysical propositions. It's an experience, and it's supposed to be transformative, where your inner life is transformed to experience life in a much more meaningful and deep way. That's what the goal is here. Okay, we're again just about done. I think I can finish this really quickly. If you need to go, that's fine. I try to finish this in 5 minutes. The idea of God, I've suggested that we don't even need to get into the metaphysics to make Hinduism or facets of Hinduism something that you can live and apply in your life. Right? But realistically, people have had thoughts about what God is, right? You have to get into the theology of it, the metaphysics of it. Right? The idea is, of course, is that God is infinite. There's no limitations to God, and God is unconditioned. Right? God's nature is not determined by outside factors, whereas our everyday self is. Right? We've talked about this. You were born into the world with a specific body, with a specific temperament and brain, and you had a specific set of life experiences. You were born into a specific culture. All those things conditioned who that self is that's been created, that you identify with in your everyday life. But God is a way of talking about what in reality is unconditioned. Right? So it's a way of talking about reality as a whole, maybe. Right? And maybe there's no limitations to reality as a whole. There may be things that are conditioned within the whole that we can uncondition to some extent, but the whole itself is infinite and unconditioned. But our everyday minds, our everyday perceptions, they're finite, right? And our mind conditions what we experience through all sorts of filters that maybe we're born with, that everybody has, right? We have spatiotemporal filters, right? We experience this large reality that is actually infinite and multi-layered, but we can only experience it in these three-dimensional chunks one moment at a time, right? That's conditioning occurring there, right? So our experience of reality is never of the whole reality itself. We condition our experience. The philosopher Immanuel Kant talks about this in the Western tradition. The idea that our minds don't just passively observe reality as it truly is. We create a version of reality that we experience. Color is a great example of this, right? The color of something. I've probably brought this up before. Right? What's actually out there? In reality, there's light waves that are bouncing off the surface. They bounce into your eyeball, and then the back of your eyeball gets this sort of Morse code signal, and your brain then interprets that signal as the experience of red. Right? So when you see colors out there in the world, it's your mind conditioning reality. What's out there is light waves. Well, your mind is creating this colorful reality. Oh, colors are different in the moonlight. Yeah, you can see how under different circumstances, colors appear different. We could talk about that viral dress. Remember, what color is the dress? Right? Yeah, this just goes to show color perception is subjective. What's actually out there is not the color, it's just light waves, right? So our everyday experience, science confirms this, right? Optics and the study of how our brains interpret light signals, well, that confirms this idea that we condition our everyday experience in a very radical way. Even just our colorful world itself is conditioned by the mind. Okay, that's in our experience. God, however, is unconditioned. So again, are we saying, well, God is this supernatural being with a mind who is infinite and conditioned? Or are we saying God is just the word that we can use for infinite reality, right? Where we don't have to make up our minds what that is. We just, because number 3 says this, it's easier to say what God is not than to say what God is. I love making connections to other religions. As you've noticed before, we have the same tradition here in Christianity. There are certain theologians are people who study God and the nature of God, who have suggested that what's called via negativa, right? That God can only be defined negatively. We can't actually say what God is. We can only say what God is not. So the title given to this idea of unconditioned infinite reality is Brahman. And like we mentioned, the gods in the pantheon of gods, the polytheism of Hinduism, well, these are all just different personifications of Brahman. Okay. I'm repeating things I've said already. What are Brahman's attributes? Well, these are the things that we want that we talked about earlier, right? Remember, the human condition is such that we crave our own continued existence. We crave being. What kind of being are we? We are conscious beings who know the world around us. We perceive the world around us. We crave connection to the world around us. And in that connection, we find bliss. And to the extent that we are disconnected, we feel bad, okay? So Brahman then is being itself, Sat. And chit, awareness, or again, consciousness of reality, right? A conscious awareness of the world. This is what was earlier called knowledge when we saw those 3 different things, right? Those 3 different things that we want find their corollary in Brahman, right? So we crave being, we crave knowledge. These are Sat and Chit, and then Ananda, joy or bliss. These are God's attributes. So it's as though God is pure being and consciousness, and that consciousness is blissful. Now that's metaphysically, this is starting to look like God is the sort of being that's separate, right? God is just blissful consciousness, and it's sort of free floating. That's one way to interpret it. It can also just be, again, a way of talking about the experience that's possible for human beings, and maybe the best way to talk about that experience is to say union with the divine. I found God. I am at one, right? Maybe those are just ways of talking about a personal experience. So I'm always want to, give you the philosophical and the psychological side, right? You have different modes of interpreting this. You could say that this is some metaphysical entity out there. There's Brahman, who's God, and he has these attributes. Or you can say these are ways of talking about human experience. Now, since God in himself is infinite and unconditioned, but human beings have a hard time wrapping their minds around that, right? We talked about this earlier, especially for the affective, emotive person. It's going to be much more, it's going to be much easier to connect or to conceptualize God as an actual person, a living, loving person, because human beings are born that way into the world to connect with human beings. Right? And that's where we find our best kind of connection is with other human beings, with other minds, with other consciousnesses. Right? It's hard to say consciousness as a plural, but that's what I mean here. Right? So within Hinduism, there's this tradition of personifying God as a loving person, or as personifying different aspects of God as different people, as different divine persons. So God's true essence is beyond our actual understanding, but we can experience God as a personal being, like in a lot of traditional religions, where God is a being who listens to you, who loves you, you love God, you adore God, right? It's a personal relationship. Or if you're more on the philosophical side of things, it's just sort of this ocean of absolute being. You can't quite grasp it. You just know that there's something beyond your own mind, and it's a great big reality out there, right? It's a great big just look at the universe itself, but then realize that even when you experience parts of the universe, you're not experiencing the whole, and you have a finite mind, and reality itself, for all you know, is infinitely layered. And so you can just become overcome with a kind of mystical reverence for the absoluteness and the infinitude of reality itself. And so the religious feeling can come about that way instead, right? So there's a very personal way of interpreting God, and there's a more non-personal way of interpreting God. And we will see this in other religious traditions as well. In personal terms, now here we get to something that people may have heard of. Okay, I'm really almost done here. We can talk about the creative aspect of God. If we talk about God as absolute being, well, out of this absolute being, we get this whole world that we experience, right? It sort of flows out of God, as it were. We'll see the same thing in Taoism, that everything flows from some ultimate source, whether this is a truly creative, intelligent action, or if it just sort of happens because that's the flow of reality. That's the Tao. Either way, we can talk about God as sort of this creative force. That's what we personify as the god Brahma. Not Brahman, right? Brahma. It gets confusing, right? Brahma is an aspect of Brahman, right? It's the creative part of him. And there's a preserving aspect, right? God as absolute being is constantly keeping everything in place, keeping everything flowing, right? That's what we call Vishnu. But things are also going out of existence, and that is also traced back to the source of all being, what the theologian Tillich called the ground of all being, and he said this in a Christian context, but we can talk about Brahma in that sense as well. That's what we call Shiva. So if you know about these three gods, right? Yeah, it's very similar to the Trinity in Christianity, where there's these three different personalities that somehow exist in one God. Right. It's very similar here. We have three different personalities. They're divine personalities, and they represent different aspects of God. I should be done, but I want to start the next one next time, so I don't want to finish this later. I really am almost done. Individual souls emerge out of being, and they pass through a sequence of bodies. We looked at this idea, right? You know what? In fact, so much of this is reincarnated from things I've already said. You know what? I think I will actually be done here. I'll just sort of put this down. You can look at this and read it. I'll keep this up for a second, but I don't think I need to reiterate all this because a lot of this stuff I've already discussed. Okay, so let us be done here. I appreciate your patience, Alicia. That you sat through it. I kind of go long every time, but that's the way it is. Okay, then I will see everybody on what day is today? Today, Thursday already? Okay, I'll see you on Tuesday. All right, goodbye, everybody.